Hello and welcome to another cross-examined video. Today I want to take a look at one of the issues that tends to get slammed against the Bible when people are trying to find reasons to not believe in it or reasons to discredit it. And one of those reasons has never really made sense to me. It's regarding the question of slavery. There are many people today that I hear they claim the Bible can't be trusted because it condones rather than condemns slavery. And for many Christians that can seem like such an odd attack, because if you know anything about the Bible, anything about God, you know that God doesn't condone slavery, at least not in the context that you and I might know it to be in the modern age. So rather than just dismissing the question as not worth engaging with, I figured it'd be worth digging into, at least for me, so that I can be better informed when accusations and questions like this arise. So where does this accusation stem from? Well, it might surprise you, but the Bible was actually used to condone slavery in the 1800s. And if we're being honest, probably before that and after that. History buffs out there might be familiar with a little book referred to as the Slave Bible. And I say little book because compared to the actual Bible, there's a lot missing in that book. Slaveholders in the 1800s would give their slaves this Bible, and they omitted a lot of information from the Bible. They omitted a lot of the Old Testament and about half of the New Testament because they wanted their slaves to be better slaves. So they omitted anything about deliverance or freedom, anything like that. They removed the story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt. They didn't include the story of Joseph's slavery in Egypt. Hopefully, even this early on in the video, you can begin to see how this accusation against Christianity in the Bible doesn't really hold water. Was the Bible used to condone slavery? Yes, absolutely. But it wasn't because the Bible actually condoned it. It's because those people twisted the Bible to condone it. It's a group of people who selectively edited the Bible so that it supported their evil lifestyle. We unfortunately still have this going on nowadays for a variety of sins, but that's another video for another time. Let's dig deeper into this question. I'm not satisfied with just saying, they edited the Bible and they presented it to their slaves. That's all there is to it. Now, there are still verses and passages in the Bible that, if not properly understood in their context, could be twisted to support slavery. For example, let's look at what is probably a slaveholder's favorite verse, Ephesians 6:5. Now, if you're familiar with the end of Ephesians 5 and the beginning of Ephesians 6, you'll know that the Apostle Paul was laying out roles and functions for the family unit. He covers wives, husbands, children, and then we get to Ephesians 6:5, where he addresses bondservants. At least that's what the English Standard Version says. Your translation might say slaves or employees or something along those lines. Now, there are two things to note here. First, I want to look at the Greek word, and then I want to look at what that word meant to these people in that time, in that place. So first, when we're looking at the Greek, there's a basic principle that we need to understand in their language. In English, we have a ton of words. Our language, in many ways, is structured on trying to have a word only mean one or two things. And sometimes we even have multiple words that all mean the same thing. But the Greek language does not have near as many words. Many of their words contained multiple meanings. And it was up to the speaker to clarify the meaning of the word by the context it was placed in. This word is one example of that. The Greek word here is doulos. And in some verses in the Bible, it means slave. And in some verses, it means employee. And in some verses, it means servant. And sometimes it means voluntary, while other times it means involuntary. In that culture, there were many different types of employment that would qualify under the word doulos. It could be that I took on a loan, and part of me paying that debt, paying the loan back, is that I agree to work for the guy down the street for the next 2 years. Or maybe I just enter into an employment contract like we work today, where I work a day and get paid for a day, and that's the agreement that I came to with that boss. Maybe I damaged their property, and the punishment given to me is that I have to work for them for a certain amount of time until that property is paid off. And the list of examples goes on and on. So we have to keep that in mind when we really read anything in the Bible. And that's what brings the second item to mind, the context. How would the church in Ephesus have understood that word in this verse? What does it mean? What did it mean to them at that time in that place? Well, I think the context is pretty easy to understand if you just read a few more verses. Verse 5 here talks about bondservants, which are basically employees, to obey their earthly masters and to do good work for them as they would for the Lord. And that's where most slaveholders stop quoting the passage. If you read ahead and get to verse 9, you'll get an idea of what relationship God is encouraging here. Verse 9 says, "Masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. I imagine that's one of the verses you would not find in the slave Bible. And that's unfortunately how most of the verses like this in the Bible are treated. People hear what they want to hear, they pull it out of context, and they twist it to mean what they want. And that's why we as Christians need to be vigilant in our understanding of God's word. This has happened and will continue to happen. And if we don't know how God has revealed himself in his word, we can be led astray or allow others to be led astray because we just don't have an awareness. And so that's what I want to do now, is build the case for why God is against and has always been against slavery as we know it today. So let's start with the Old Testament, because that's where a lot of accusations against the Bible are leveled. What does the Old Testament say about slavery? Well, in Exodus, the second book of the Bible, in chapter 21, verse 16, God condemns to the point of death anyone who kidnaps and sells a person. And he also condemns to death anyone who buys that person. So the slaver who sells and the slaver who buys are both condemned to death in the Old Testament. Let's skip ahead to Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. I'll paraphrase it here because the English is a little wonky. But basically what the law says here is that if a slave escapes and comes to your door, it's actually illegal for you to return them to their former master. He gets to stay with you, and he also gets to choose where else he might live in the city. Now think of that in the context of something like slavery in America, where slaves would run and then would be returned to their masters with bruises and broken bones. The two don't line up, and the latter goes directly against the law of God in the Old Testament. It's not just that it stands in contrast to American slavery. These verses also directly go against any of the cultures that existed at that time. You think ancient Babylon cared about how they treated their slaves? No, the slave was property to them. It's only in the Judeo-Christian faith where you find intrinsic value in people. Even the way that slavery was set up in the Jewish culture was different than most cultures. Most of the slavery in the Jewish culture, as we mentioned earlier, was voluntary. There were even limits to how long someone could serve. Exodus 21, which we mentioned earlier, also states that the max amount of time that a slave could work would be 6 years. In the 7th year, they were required to be released. The book of Exodus also regulates the treatment of slaves. Later in chapter 21, it says that if the master strikes the slave and they lose a tooth or an eye, then they are to be released from their contract. If the master kills a slave, then their death is avenged. What this shows is that the law of God established that all life, even and especially the life of a slave, is equal in value. All right, let's jump to the New Testament. The New Testament actually has some interesting insights into slavery in God's eyes. We already addressed the passage in Ephesians, but there's actually an entire book. Granted, it's a short book, but an entire book nonetheless, that is dedicated to the relationship between a slaveholder and a slave. The book is Philemon, and it's a letter that Paul addresses to Philemon, and it's about this slave that ran away, met Paul, became a Christian, and so Paul writes this letter to Philemon and sends the slave back and encourages him not to receive the slave back as a servant, but as a brother. We can also look to Paul's first letter to Timothy in chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, where Paul says that enslavers, those who kidnap and sell people, are lawless and disobedient and ungodly. Or we can look at Revelation 18, where Paul lists slavery as one of the sins of Rome. My point in listing all these examples is to show you that the Bible and ultimately God have always been against slavery. The slavery of kidnapping, beating, abusing, selling, mistreating, dehumanizing. God has always been against that. And I'm just listing the verses that deal directly with slavery. I'm not even taking the approach of building the case from the perspective that humans have value because they're created in the image of God. That's another argument that you could take to this. I think it's clear, and it's always been clear, that God hates slavery as we define it today. The Bible has never condoned or approved slavery, but that won't stop people from taking his word and twisting it to their own viewpoint and their perspective. And that's why it's so crucial for us to have a clear understanding of who God is, who he has revealed himself to be. It's here in his word, and we should be so in love with him that we can't get enough of him in his word, and we just dig in and go deeper and deeper into his word and what he says about himself. But hey, maybe I've missed something. Maybe there's a point that you want to bring up that makes the argument more clearly, or that goes along with this well. So if you have something like that, I'd love to continue the discussion with you. You can reach out and we can keep that conversation going. But as always, thank you for watching. May God bless, and I'll see you soon.